Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Geopolitical Pickle. Today we're gonna have a special episode because it's the end of the year 2025. I'm your host Juan Francisco Muñoz, and today I'm joined by my colleague Matt Havel. How are you?
I'm good. Season's greetings to everyone out there in the pickle sphere who listens or reads us.
Well, just to let our listeners know, in case they're a little bit lost, Ronan is not here today because he's spending Christmas in the land down under. We hope that the Australian emu tension doesn't spark any conflict and that he can come back to Prague safely. So as I said, today we will be having a special episode. We will be reviewing some of the topics that we have been writing about during the year in our newsletter, the Pickle Gazette, which I hope that you have already signed into because we are bringing you bi-weekly articles of different geopolitical topics that so far are been of really interest of the people reading them.
It's impossible to mention everything, right? It's a big world, so many news stories in 2025. But if you want to spend the end of the year listening about geopolitics, you can always go check out our other podcast episodes. There's a great interview with Jakub Lewandowski. He was a former ambassador to NATO of the Czech Republic, and he chatted about the internal situation of the NATO alliance since the Russian invasion to Ukraine, and of course all the shockwaves of everything the Trump administration is doing to the North Atlantic relations.
And again, you can also read our bi-weekly Substack newsletter, the Pickle Gazette, that does not stop growing, and Matt here is actually a regular publisher. Well, how has your experience been? You've been with us for almost a year now.
That's right. It is really great to not only write about something, you can do a bit of a deep dive into a topic that you think you know something about, and then you learn so much more. And then we also have a great set of writers, producers, editors, who also bring all their knowledge to the table. So it's not just writing, but you also learn a ton about everything going on in the world.
Well, in the 28 articles published there this year, we have explained basic geopolitical concepts that are perfect to set the ground base for any geopolitical analysis. If you would like to learn more about what is geopolitics and what factors are determining the different positions of states, you can find the newsletter in our social media and all of our contact details in the links below. Have you have any favorite article of the Pickle Gazette this year, Matt?
Yeah, I did. We just talked about thinking you know something because it's in the headlines, but then not really understanding it. And one of our colleagues, David, wrote an amazing article about rare earths. People talk about this all the time, rare earths, but to actually go in depth and figure out what it is, where it comes from, and why it's used was really, really fascinating.
It was really, really interesting, actually. We've been talking about rare earths in our group for a long time. This is probably one of the topics for today and for the next 10 years. So we were definitely going to come back to that, even today as well. So first off, just to give you a bit of an understanding, first off, in the newsletter, we started explaining what are the realms of geopolitics, which are land, sea, air, space, and cyber. And this is the basis of everything that we explored afterwards. And you can find a concise yet really interesting explanation of each of them in the newsletter. Later in our almost finished series about the regions of the world, we have touched upon some key aspects that have driven this year's geopolitical arena. And Matt, this is how it's going to start. We're going to be reviewing a bit of the articles that we were publishing this year, and that's going to give us space for more comments on the situations, the geopolitical issues that have been going on throughout the year. Let me tell you in advance, we cannot make a thorough explanation of the entire year because if anything this year has been eventful. We were chatting about it. We could have made this episode just with the first 2 months of 2025. We could have made a recap that would have lasted 2 hours and a half.
You remember the fires in California? That was January of this year somehow.
I can't believe it. No. Honestly, it's just I feel like since Trump got in office, the time is relative phrase became an actual
That's
thing.
right.
Like we've had news basically every day. So it is difficult to make a whole summary of the year. However, we will touch upon these topics that we have also been speaking about so that also you can go back to the newsletter and get more information about it. So with this, let's start. The first one was, well, they're not going to be in order of publication. They're going to be in the order that I've decided to have for this episode. Okay, so let's start with the regions, and let's start with 2 articles that we wrote on Central and South America. One is islands and isthmuses, and the other is the Andean archipelago. In these articles, we looked at the regions of Central America, the Caribbean Basin, and the Andean community. At the heart of this region lies one of its most critical geopolitical assets, which is the Panama Canal. The canal handles roughly 5% of global maritime trade, which is even more important for the United States because it gets to up to 40% of its international trade. This artificial choke point is not only vital for connecting the US East and West Coast, but it's also increasingly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, where severe droughts threaten to paralyze global commerce. In the Andes, the situation is also precarious. The historically ideal conditions that the region has had to host agriculture and cultivation such like coffee or bananas is being heavily affected by climate change. It has as well become the center of cocaine production in the world, particularly in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, and it has enabled the development of powerful non-state actors that seriously threaten the internal stability of the countries and the stability of the region as a whole. For 2 centuries, the region has lived in the shadow of the Monroe Doctrine, which was viewed as Washington not as a collection of sovereign states, but as its strategic backyard. If you have any knowledge about the Cold War, you will see that this is one of the driving foreign policies of the United States. This history of intervention has fostered deep structural vulnerabilities, creating economies that rely in precarious industries such as tourism and remittances. And this economic fragility has left a vacuum filled with powerful non-state actors, turning the region into a primary transit corridor for narcotics and weapon smuggling. The flow of drugs north and money south has empowered cartels that often outgun the local governments, driving cycles of violence and migration that dominate the headlines today and that they've been dominating for the past 30 years. Finally, in this article, we examined how the historic US monopoly on power in the region is crumbling as China has entered the chat, leveraging its Belt and Road Initiative to finance massive infrastructure projects and isolate Taiwan diplomatically. This renewed great power competition places these small nations in a familiar bind, trapped between a distant superpower offering depth-heavy development and a northern neighbor focused on security and migration control. The central question the region faces today is whether these nations can leverage this rivalry and achieve some genuine sovereignty, or if they're just destined to remain strategic pawns in the global game. And I think with this, we can enter in the first topic of this year that we're going to be speaking about, which is the US Navy is moving towards the Caribbean. What is going on?
It feels like instead of 2025, it's 1899. Theodore Roosevelt's the president of the United States, and he just wants a war, and he's trying to conjure something up by either building the Panama Canal and basically orchestrating a coup in Panama against Colombia. But we haven't been this militarily active in the region for a long time. In the Cold War, it was all about really underhanded activities by the CIA in, you name it, anywhere from Guatemala in the 50s, Chile in the 70s, Argentina in the 80s. Like there's just, the region is rife with these type of CIA coups and plots, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua in the 80s. But this is the first time in a long time it feels like that U.S. military kind of proper has been in this region, and it doesn't seem like a good thing. Certainly Venezuela has had a lot of problems after Hugo Chavez, even with Chavez in power in the 2010s. Now it's Maduro. The country is in really bad shape. I used to live in Ecuador and Colombia around 2018, and the refugee situation there was already bad, and that was 7 years ago. It's gotten nothing but worse, and now the U.S. military is essentially bombing what they say are drug smuggling boats and calling it essentially an existential crisis that they need to stop these drugs from coming in. And it's kind of unclear of where this is going. I mean, honestly, this will be, I think, a big story for the next year of, is the U.S. going to invade Venezuela? Are we just going to come in and take its oil? Are we going to try to arrest Maduro like they did to Noriega, the leader of Panama in the 80s? There's a lot of different ways this could go, and none of it seems great, to be honest.
It does look a bit shady, everything, because, for example, now Maria Corina Machado, the leader of the opposition in Venezuela, has received the Nobel Peace Prize in I always say, I've heard this. This is not my phrase, but I do agree that you should not give Nobel Peace Prizes to people that are alive, because you never know. But it is true that there is definitely a push from the American administration to remove Maduro from office once and for all. Although, as you say, it's not clear whether this is going to be an attempt like supporting an internal coup, intervening in the country, invading the country, which military wise it would be really complicated given the geography of Venezuela. But taking over the capital, for example, is not necessarily that difficult because it's right at the seashore, and so basically it wouldn't be, in my opinion, it wouldn't be the wisest idea. But at the same time, we are not in the time of wise decisions, we're in the time of tempered decisions. So maybe in the next year we will see. What we can say for now is that this alleged relation of Venezuela and the Venezuela leadership with the narcotics trade into the United States, with the Cartel de los Soles, is also not really proven. Because, as we've mentioned, most of this cocaine production and narcotics production is actually based in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. And then the cartels dealing with it are mostly based in Colombia and Mexico. So it's not really clear how these cartels from Venezuela are actually being the ones bringing the narcotics into the US.
The other really interesting thing that we'll have to watch is, you mentioned cocaine, which is, I think everyone knows, the drug that they are alleging is being smuggled. But the US public is rightly concerned much more with fentanyl. For those unaware, fentanyl is devastating. It's multiple times the strength of heroin, but the same type of chemical. There is some legitimate medical uses for it, but it has basically ravaged the US. If people have heard of the Sackler family, it started out the opium crisis. They're now talking about fentanyl, which can be smuggled very easily. And it's mostly smuggled via Mexico, interestingly, with some parts of it being manufactured in China, which is an entirely different episode. But fentanyl is rightly a crisis in the US, and people are rightly concerned about it. It's causing hundreds of thousands of people to die. Cocaine, not that cocaine is a great drug, but it pales in comparison to the devastation that fentanyl has wreaked upon the US. And now it's kind of moving into Europe, honestly, is what I've heard recently. But the administration keeps trying to just say drugs as if cocaine and fentanyl are in the same category. And most people aren't buying that, right? They're saying, well, okay, cocaine's not great, but like, why are we spending military resources on anti-cocaine movements when fentanyl is the real problem? And it'd be really interesting to see if the administration can make that argument successfully, that these bombings or potentially extra action next year by the military are worth it to stop something like cocaine. Again, the Pickle is not endorsing cocaine, but it is really something that pales in comparison to the devastation of fentanyl, which is really what the administration should be focusing on if they're focusing on this war of drugs. So much like back in 2003, when, even though the Taliban came from Afghanistan, the Bush administration basically tried to tie that together as a global kind of war on terror and say Iraq was part of it. And the public bought it or didn't buy it based on which side you were on. But now, after that's kind of fallen flat, this idea that they're trying to kind of marry these two concepts that are related, but not really related well enough to spend a significant amount of military force, I don't know that it's going to work, why I think a lot of people are skeptical. The other thing is Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, or Secretary of War, as he likes to be called, is kind of the front man on this. And there was a story out recently, you talked about international law, where there was a second bombing, right? They bombed a boat, and then they bombed it a second time with people in the water. Most people agreed that if that's how it went down, that's a war crime. And that's really hard to say.
It's double tapping, it's called, right?
Right. That's really hard to say from someone who was, a military lawyer for the US, but that's something you can't do. And that kind of raised eyebrows, even amongst the MAGA crowd, even amongst the Republican crowd. And so if they keep doing things like that, I think it's going to be a topic to watch in 2026 if they can sell the public on whatever they want to sell the public on vis-a-vis Venezuela. But it's not going great for them. One, because they just don't have a great argument. And two, because like so many other things that the Secretary of War is doing, it's done very ham-handedly. It's done very kind of just in your face, don't ask questions, I'm the leader. And it's not really the appetite for this, especially when Trump is the guy who said Iraq was a big mistake. He's, the president of peace, right? It's pretty contradictory, and the contradiction is just out for everyone to see.
I'd say that there's also there's also the situation that there is an outrage in the region because of this happening, because the United States has actually, the current administration has actually had spats with other countries in the region, such as Colombia, such as Mexico, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But obviously there is not a support, there would not be a regional support of the United States intervening in Venezuela, regardless of what these countries think of the Venezuelan government, because they have been critics of the government, but at the same time they would not like, or at least it seems like they would not like, to come back to this America's backyard policy situation in the region. And with this, I want to highlight as well one of the hot topics of the beginning of Trump's presidency, which was the tensions in the Panama Canal, which is also in this region. As I mentioned in the introduction, the Panama Canal basically is host for 5% of global trade and 40% of the US trade. And the problem is that there's been certain Chinese companies that have been buying infrastructure on both sides of the canal, although the canal in itself remains dependent of the Panama government. And this was enough reason for the current US administration to say, okay, if the Chinese are not living there, we may even be thinking about invading the Panama Canal, which would go directly affecting the international trade that goes through those waters. That is something that in the past few months, it's not been that much spoken, but because there's so many news coming from Washington, we don't really know if this is something that will get to anything more concise. But it is true that the Panama government had to have talks with China, and this was another point of friction between Beijing and Washington, as we will be seeing later.
Juanfrey, do you know the history of the Panama Canal a little bit?
I do, actually. Yes, I like the watermelon war, the war of the watermelon.
It's kind of a crazy place because I went there a number of years ago, and you just think it's a canal, but really when you see these massive, massive ships that have nothing but a couple centimeters clearance when they're going through these locks, and you know that this is just global trade happening before your eyes. But then you look at the history, and for a long time, the canal zone was U.S. territory, right? It was not quite a colony, but it was U.S. territory. John McCain, the late senator from Arizona and a presidential candidate, was born in the canal zone, right? He was actually born there. So when they were making a whole thing about how Obama wasn't born in the U.S., people were like, well, neither was McCain, because he was born in this canal zone. And only in 1990... Jimmy Carter in the 70s signed the treaty that said, hey, we'll give it back to Panama. It happened in the 90s under President Clinton. And Panama has actually done a really good job running it. They had to expand it, both in terms of depth and in terms of breadth, to get ready for these massive new tankers. And they did a great job of it. The expansion took a long time, but they've run it really well. The Chinese were talking about building an alternate canal through Nicaragua for a time, and I think that's kind of gone awry. And I think, like you said, their new strategy is, well, if we can't build our own canal, let's see how much real estate we can get vis-a-vis Panama on these things. So like you said, this is massively important to North America. It truly connected the East and West Coast, over 100 years ago. The idea that the fact that they built it was a technological marvel at the time. And like you said, it's been pretty quiet because people want their stuff, right? And that's what you don't want to mess with canals, because everyone wants their stuff. The Suez getting blocked, I think it was last year when they had the tanker go sideways. Maybe it was the year before. Everyone was in uproar because they didn't get their stuff. But if China's trying to encroach in this area, the canal is maybe a red line for the U.S., I would imagine. Like, more than a lot of other places, that is something that rely on so very specifically.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, we will probably do an episode on the canal because it's something really interesting from its history, how it becomes part of the United States after being part of the Great of Colombia in the late 19th, beginning of the 20th century. But yeah, of course, I mean, if the canal gets shut or gets blocked by China for whatever reason, the United States would be unable to meet the West Coast and East Coast fleet. So it would definitely be a massive problem for the United States because it's one of its biggest assets nowadays. Okay, so then let's go and talk about what we are
Okay,
talking
let's
about.
move on to North America. The episode's called Three's a Crowd. It was also spoken about in one of the podcasts. Here, basically analyzed North America, which goes from the kind of the North Pole all the way down to the tropical tip of Mexico. So it really goes through so many different weather regions, to be honest, from tundra all the way down to tropical. People know what North America is, but keep in mind how important it is for the geopolitics. It's got strategic access to the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Arctic, and the Gulf of Mexico, or if we're calling it the Gulf of America at this point,
No.
because this happened this year, if everyone remembers that, in January. So think about it. Canada, the U.S., and Mexico are one of the few countries that have access to multiple oceans at the same time. And of course, the U.S. being the dominant power there, that's one of the reasons it was able to be the dominant power, is because it had that. Of course, they have deep water ports, so they've got this amazing structure of global trade. The U.S., as people say, has won the lottery in terms of geographics. They are two massive oceans, a set of rivers, and a deep set of ports that allows for easy trade. Of course, the breadbasket of the U.S. and Canada flows all the way from the Mississippi down into the Gulf, pretty much uninterrupted. Unlike other rivers in the Amazon, in the Nile, and various parts of Africa, the waterways are pretty easy to navigate, which makes it honestly, it's cheaper to move things by water than it is by land. So North America, I mean, some of the things that have been going on this year, the U.S. is kind of the villain in the story, because Canada and Mexico generally get along with North America. So the fact that the U.S. Was kind of provoking Canada, Trump talked about it being the 51st state. It seemed likely that a Trump-based Canadian would win the parliamentary elections, but because everyone in Canada was upset, they actually ended up electing Mark Carney, who is a much more centrist figure, who has maybe done one of the best jobs of world leaders in terms of navigating Trump and in terms of projecting strength that he can, while also not trying to burn a relationship. The USMCA is the free trade agreement that has replaced NAFTA, which is always in flux with trade that we'll be talking about later. But one of the biggest things, it's a little bit south of North America, but it's El Salvador, one of the places that the U.S. gets a lot of both legal and illegal immigrants from. There's an interesting guy who's president down there, and he's tried to do a lot of things. El Salvador has had a lot of issues, and he's kind of come in and done a huge anti-crime campaign, which has worked, but to the detriment of civil liberties. And now there are these supermax security prisons that the U.S. was sending people they deported to. And there was a famous story of someone who was allowed to be in the U.S. that was sent down to this prison, and the El Salvadorian president basically said, "What can we do? We can't do anything." And it took them a long time, many court orders, to get that person back to the U.S. So it's one of these examples. You talk about Venezuela. There's a lot of other leaders that can see Trump and his transactional nature as something that's positive if they're willing to do his dirty work, like El Salvador is. So it's been a huge story that was at the beginning of the year when the ICE deportations really started en masse in the U.S., and how other countries in the region can decide how to act. Canada was kind of, I think, rightfully pushing back. Mexico had to pick their battles, but smaller countries like El Salvador maybe found a way to basically be Trump's bagman and get a significant amount of money out of it. What do you think about these stories, Marfrey?
I mean, I'd say the most interesting part this year has been how this seemingly unbreakable alliance in North America between the three states has been, I wouldn't say shattered, not even crumbled, but it's definitely been weakened to a point that I did not think possible. When you have, and I'd say it's for different, similar reasons, but I'd say the reaction has been different. For example, Canada has been more looking outwards, for example, to the European Union. There's been even talks, which is definitely not concise and it's definitely not happening. But Canada having some sort of participation with the EU in certain economic matters, and so that they're not that much dependent on the United States, although trade-wise, right now, it's still completely dependent on the United States. Mexico has seen itself in a situation where they have to be facing the tariffs of Trump, and there's also a lot of derogatory comments and to Mexican descendants in the United States. But at the same time, because of the economic conditions, there were many American companies that were, for example, producing in China, that in this year and in the following years, they are planning on moving into Mexico because of the working conditions and because of them being because of the volatility of the United States policies and the trade routes and the international markets. Having your factory in Mexico allows you for having a much closer production site that then you can export into the United States. So for Mexico, Trump has both been an opportunity and a challenge. And then again, the personal relation, the political relation between the United States with its immediate neighbors, I'd say it's at an all-time low in recent history. Obviously, there's past history that we can talk about. I mean, there's a chunk of Mexico, of the United States, that Mexican will never relinquish as their own. But in the past 40 years, there's not been this level of tension between the three states. And this is something that we'll see how it plays out next year, but it has definitely been my biggest surprise, I would say, especially in the beginning of the Trump administration. I could see him picking a fight with Europe or with China or with Russia, but I could definitely not see him picking a fight with Canada. Canada was when it was claimed that Canada was a route for smuggling fentanyl into the United States, and then I remember we spoke about it, and Ronan mentioned that the amount that had been found to be smuggled from Canada to the United States was in the amount of one backpack. It was like
it was a carry-on.
It was a carry-on of like 15 pounds, something like that. I don't know. It was really, yeah. These tensions have been rising, but I would say I'd agree with you that Mike Carney has known how to navigate that in a really good way, and I'd say that Sheinbaum in Mexico has also known how to leverage Trump's positioning here, or at least she has not shown herself as losing in any situation. So we will see. Definitely the tension is there, and this, as I said, unbreakable, long-standing relation between these three states is definitely weakening now, and we'll see if other actors such as the European Union or China can get better connections with both Canada and Mexico, and in the near future they decouple a little bit from the United States, making it a bit more isolationist.
All right, shall we move on and go north a little bit?
Let's go. Let's
Okay.
Let's go for the cold.
So you know, it's a holiday season, and so we're going to talk about the most important figure of the day, which is of course Santa Claus. And Santa Claus, as everyone knows, resides up in the Arctic Circle. The Arctic is an emerging major geopolitical arena due to its unique geography and the limited number of countries with territory inside the Arctic Circle. Control of the region depends on a few narrow maritime choke points that regulate access. So we did a newsletter on this. If you look at a map from the top of the world, it's not like the Antarctic where there's just so much ocean down in the southern hemisphere. In the north, you have almost an enclosed space, and the only three ways to get to the Arctic Ocean are via the Bering Strait, which is right next to where I used to live in Alaska, between Alaska and Russia. Then there's the space between Canada and Greenland, and there's a space between basically Greenland and Norway. They call it the GUK, the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. That's it. There's no other ways to access it. China keeps wanting access. They keep calling themselves a near Arctic country, which is basically an attempt to rebrand to get them in the game. But at the end of the day, you've got Russia, you have the US, you've got Canada, you've got Denmark via Greenland, which is why Greenland is one of the reasons it's so important. And you've got Norway and Iceland, and the very tiny little bit of Iceland that touches the Arctic Circle. And that's kind of it. But what's happening, of course, is climate change. Climate change is reducing the sea ice. That basically means that as the ice melts, there's more sea to travel through. And when you're traveling north, and those routes are actually viable, you're really cutting off travel time in terms of 40%, in terms of time, cost for global trade. Since so much of the population lives in the northern hemisphere, it really could be a game changer. Of course, the loser in all of this is the environment. But, you know, geopolitical realities being what they are, the Arctic is absolutely an issue, or excuse me, a region for trade. The other part of it is what we talked about kind of a little while ago, is there's a lot of potential for fossil fuels, for rare earths, for some of these other resources that aren't elsewhere. And it's one of the reasons we haven't talked about Greenland a lot, but Greenland was also in this kind of first beginning of the year. It was even in Trump 1 where Donald Trump won in Greenland, and people kind of made a bit of fun about it, actually. It was like, why would we want Greenland? But I don't know why he wants it. I think he just wants it because it looks big on a map and he likes owning big things. I'm being a bit facetious there. But if you look at it geopolitically, having Greenland or having access to Greenland is going to be hugely strategically important. Like I said, it is in the Arctic Circle. We do have the U.S. has a base there. They have a Space Force base there. It used to be called Thule. I think it got renamed. J.D. Vance went there and was famously booed by the tiny population of the city.
There's 50,000 people.
Yeah, 50,000. Greenland's a really interesting place because there's a lot of. They just had elections this past year, and I think 5 out of the 6 major parties want independence from Denmark. And Denmark's one of these countries that says, listen, if you want independence, we'll support you in this. The only difference between the parties is how long and in which way they'll get independent, but they are they're basically self-governing in a lot of things, but they're also massively dependent on Denmark for subsidies. I think it's half their budget or something like that. So the people of Greenland, like you said, the 50,000 or so people of Greenland want independence. They don't want much to do with America. But the problem is, if you have a massive piece of land that people think have a lot of strategic oil and rare earth mineral reserves, and you become independent, and you're not part of the EU, you're not part of any sort of other supranational organization, they're not going to be ready for world capitalism of the US, of China, of potentially Russia coming in. There was even talking about their airport just wasn't up to capacity because there's a lot of more tourists that are coming to Greenland just basically because it's been in the news more, and they just couldn't handle it, right? Of course they couldn't. It's 50,000 people. It's a massive, massive area. And I don't think they're going to know what's coming if they become independent too soon. Right now, they have the protection of Denmark, which is an EU country, so that they can be a bit more strategic about what they can do and not do, or what they should do. But if they go into the Wild West of kind of hard scrabble geopolitical realities, there's going to be a lot of companies that are going to want to come and absolutely just rake every piece of mineral and fossil fuel that they can and devastate the environment, completely mess up the local economy. It's going to be, Greenland, I think, needs to be really careful about how much they want independence versus how much they should really think twice about once they're independent and have to be on their own. Like I said, a lot of the big boys are going to come calling. So there hasn't been a ton of, besides this whole Greenland dust up at the beginning of the year, there hasn't been a ton in the Arctic. Wanfree, you know that Russia is kind of the major Arctic power. They have the most military capacity up there. The U.S. has a lot in Alaska. But in terms of the straight Arctic Circle, Russia does kind of dominate. Do you think that the Arctic is going to be in play in terms of U.S.-Russia relations? I mean, they had a big summit in Alaska, right? The one time I'm out of Alaska, a major geopolitical event happens in my city, right outside of Anchorage. Do you think, people have been talking about the Arctic for a while, do you think that that's going to be something to watch for next year?
Absolutely. And hopefully we will have an expert on the topic coming to the podcast. We've been talking about it for some time. I mean, definitely it's going to be important because climate change is going to make it important. Russia has dozens of deep water ports in the north, which China is completely willing to use. If China manages to get a trade route that goes to Europe through the North Pole, they're going to be able to avoid the Suez Canal. They're going to be able to avoid, I think they reduce 40% the time that they take to ship things into Europe, which would make also Europe more, in my opinion, closer to China. But at the same time, there is this reaction, and we can talk about it a little bit later. But also the oil shadow fleet of tankers of Russia has been operating there in the north, as far as we know, bringing the shipments from their north so that they are not controlled in the Black Sea ports. I mean, the North Pole is going to be really important, and Greenland is going to have a pivotal role in it, because Iceland is an independent country. But eh, as you were saying, as you were making the introduction and explaining the part with Greenland, how ironic it is that you are more willing to be with the country that you want an autonomy from or an independence from, because there is yet another country that now wants to buy you, which is a completely outdated way of doing international relations, by the way. Like the United States bought Louisiana from Napoleon. Like, we're talking about this kind of outdated way of doing international politics. And if the thing with the thing with Greenland is that they have a lot of treaties, not treaties, a lot of laws signed to protect their environmental rights, because, as we will explore a little bit later, rare earth minerals is not that they are rare, is that it is first of all, it is difficult to extract, so they create a lot of pollution around the extraction. It is a really intensive mining process, so not that many countries would want to have that in their territory. And for Greenland, it would basically, as you said, change entirely the face of the island. So it is gonna be a topic for the near future, for next year for sure, because the farther we get in this decade, the more important it's going to be, in my opinion. And the farther we get with climate change, the more corridors are open for trade in the north. Also, the North Pole has been important since World War II already, because basically, if you control this northern area between Iceland, the UK, and Norway, you basically control Russia's access to the ocean. It's been important in the Cold War, because the United States installed NORAD in the North Pole part of Canada. And now you have tensions between the United States and Canada as well. So it is definitely going to be a new realm of conflict between great powers. And I would like to say that, in my opinion, we should be careful, because changing the climate dynamics in the North Pole can actually affect the entire climate dynamics of the world. If we have defrosting in the North Pole, it's technically possible that Europe could stop being a warm place to become a cold place, because the Gulf current that goes from there, it's the warm current that we have, and that's why Europe, in comparison to, for example, North America, is much warmer. Madrid is at the same level as New York, but in New York it's minus 20 in winter, and in Madrid we get to 2 degrees, which is really nice. So this is something that would definitely change our livelihood. So yeah, something to take care of.
There's also our next newsletter, which I think comes out tomorrow or Thursday, the 18th, is about NORAD, and it's a nice little Christmas story. So take a look at that. We've been pretty critical about the U.S. So far. So let's turn our specter to an area closer home to you, Juan Free, and that's Europe. We had an article earlier this year called EU, the Reluctant Power. I know you're very critical of so many things that Europe does as a person who grew up here. Why don't you take us through the EU and how it stands?
Yeah, so following this series of articles that we were doing about the great powers, we started speaking about the European Union. And the EU today sits at the crossroads. It's a continent that faces a stagnant economy and demographic decline and migration issues and bureaucratic complexity and rising external threats from Russia, China, and an increasingly uncertain transatlantic relationship. I'd say this is like, there's so many things that have changed in Europe in the past 20 years that have made it be in a completely new position in the world. And the bureaucracy in Brussels is trying to navigate, but the European Union is composed of 27 states, and there's 27 foreign policies. But let's get a little bit into it. In response to all these issues, Europe has begun to act a little bit more strategically. It's trying to strengthen its defense posture through NATO and EU-led initiatives. They're trying to align their economic policy with the geopolitical goals, but then again, there's 27 different geopolitical goals. And it is really difficult to merge them at times. And they're trying to leverage the diplomatic strength that it already has in multilateralism, its soft power, and its global norm setting, which is a massive power that the European Union has in the world. Europe is resource poor, but it has proven to be highly adaptable, responding to Russia's weaponization of energy by rapidly diversifying gas supplies and accelerating its green transition. Actually, probably if Russia would have not invaded Ukraine, the green transition in Europe would have taken another 25 years, and it's really shortened the period when that can happen. Yet these new dependencies are emerging, particularly on critical raw material that you need for this green transition, of which the main exporter is China. In an era of shifting global order and a more unilateral and self-centric United States, Europe has shown an unexpected unity, at least temporarily, at least more than it was before, expanding joint borrowing, defense cooperation, and industrial policy. Whether this momentum evolves into deeper political integration could actually mark one of the most consequential geopolitical shifts in the 21st century, determining whether Europe merely adapts to the new state of affairs or reasserts itself as a central strategic actor in the world stage. There's been many things happening in the European Union for the past few years. Obviously, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's been a regroupment and realigning within the allies. However, there's still many internal political and economic issues. There's elections upcoming, and there's governments that are in critical situations, such as, for example, the government of France. At the same time, I'd say the most important issue this year for the European Union has been this worsening of relations with the United States. The change of perception within the United States of what is Europe for as an ally has taken the bureaucrats in Brussels basically off guard. And I'd say it's their fault, to be honest, because it's not like Trump was hiding this position or JD Vance was hiding this position when they were already running for the elections. But it feels like in Europe it took them some time. They thought that the right way of approaching this was just giving away to the United States, and at one point they would accept, yes, we're still allies, everything is going okay. But I'd say more and more politicians and people in Europe are thinking the United States not as an ally, but not as a partner, but as a circumstantial ally in certain aspects. So this has driven the EU to do many things. In this year, for example, a new EU budget for defense was approved in order to allow the countries to get into more debt in order to increase their arms depots. This has been one running issue since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because the European Union countries were providing Ukraine with weapon systems, but they did not have the capacity to replenish their own weapon systems, which delayed the provision of weapons to Ukraine. So this is something that Russia is being perceived more and more as an actual existential threat that can attack at least the borders of the European Union. Therefore, since we cannot really trust that the United States will be under the umbrella of NATO helping certain states, for example, I think it's clear that Washington would help Poland, but it is not that clear that Washington would help the Baltic states. Therefore, there is this perception that we need to defend ourselves. Now, this is really difficult. Again, 27 policies, and they don't really align in what are the priorities for defense. Within NATO, there's been many debates, and this 5% of defense expenditure, I think it's nonsense. I think it's nonsense because no country, except for countries like Poland, who are, and even Poland will struggle with this 5% sustained in time of defense budget. I think the countries have said to Trump, yes, we're going to put the 5% just so that Trump can go back to the United States and say, hey, I made on NATO, sign up for the 5%. But when you have a defense expenditure of 2.3, change it to 5% or 2.1 or 2. Change it to 5% within a period of 3 years for any democratic country, it's a massive issue because you really need to touch your funds for the following 3 years in such a substantial way that honestly, I was reading the articles and it's probably unrealistic for many of the countries that said yes to this 5%. But I think it's just to appall a little bit Donald Trump and say and give him his win. You know, there's been this legitimate push by the United States, not just the Trump administration, but previous administrations, that the Europeans had to take over their security, that they cannot rely on America to defend them all the time, which I believe it's true. We have we decided not to invest that much in our security, in our defense, because there was no perceived threat that could actually be problematic after the Cold War. Now Russia has become this threat, and they openly threat the European Union and European values. But again, at the same time, with the new U.S. defense, with the new U.S. Foreign policy, you also have the United States pushing against more European integration, for example. So right now, I'd say the EU is finding itself trapped in two entities that do not want them to succeed, but in different ways. Russia wants to basically shatter the union of the European Union, whereas the United States it wants the European Union to exist there, but for its own purposes, with smaller entities that they can negotiate directly instead of having to negotiate with Brussels. So this is going to be a problem, obviously, and this has been a problem this year. Obviously, another problem has been arming Ukraine. The European Union has expressed its staunch support for Ukraine and that they will continue supporting Ukraine, even if the United States falls. We will talk about it a little bit later, but even if the United States doesn't continue supporting, they would keep on supporting, and that they have to have a seat on the table when the negotiations are happening in Ukraine. But it is clear that in this case, the United States is leading the negotiations. The people at the table are Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine is not defended by anybody. Russia and the United States are clearly negotiating with each other, and they're leaving the European Union aside on purpose, because it's a power move, basically. In total, the EU countries have provided more ammunition and more money to Ukraine than the United States, but the United States as a sole entity has been the one that has provided more. So this is also something that they're leveraging. And again, this year has been another year in the European Union of disagreements, but except for this expansion of the military budget and certain advances in loosen bureaucratic restrictions to AI development, which is really important, and as well in some of these states of the European Union finding alternatives to the United States in their trade, such as, for example, I'm going to talk about my country. Why not? This is my podcast. The Spanish Prime Minister and the Spanish King went to China this year. So the two biggest representatives that we can have, they went to China this year. The King's visit was the first head of state visit of any European country to China since 2018. And this highlights that Spain wants to doesn't want to see China as an enemy like some states in the EU pose and the United States in this case pose as an enemy, as a threat, but as an opportunity as well. Yes, it is going to be a competitor, but our competitor can also provide us with tools to be more self-sufficient. In terms of green energy, for example, Europe does have the capacity to transit to this green energy with remnants of coal and a little bit of oil. It's diversified its imports of natural resources so much that right now, at least, it's not highly dependent on anybody except for rare earth minerals from China, like everybody else. I don't know how you see it from outside, Matt. If you see that Europe is banding together in a way with its difficulties, or if it's a losing project that it's something just on the surface.
Yeah, so I've only been in Europe for a little over a year, and I have to say that this is the topic. It was clear. You remember Signalgate when Pete Hegseth shared war plans over the the chat app Signal. And what was clear in that, besides the war plans, was that there was an obvious disdain of Europe from the administration. This was something that people thought was talking amongst themselves, and that's when people are the most honest. And there was clear disdain from administration members of Europe. And so it's not just an economic thing. It's not just bluster. There's some actual feelings within the administration that Europe is just a free rider, but it's Donald Trump never wants to be a sucker, and he feels like Europe has made the U.S. a sucker for a long time because, like you said, the Europeans weren't providing for their own security. So, but Europe, on the other hand, doesn't seem to have. They've taken the wake up call that, like you said, presidents for years have told the Europeans they need to contribute in more security. This is not a Donald Trump thing. That goes back to probably the first Bush, maybe even Clinton before that. Like, it's been going on for 20 years. And they're finally taking the wake-up call because Trump is just frankly more frank about it than some of the other ones. And he'd be the first president to actually act on the threat of not actually supporting the Europeans. But at the same time, despite the fact that they see this disdain from the U.S., there is still this idea, it's a really bad analogy, but as a former prosecutor, it feels like a spouse trapped in an emotionally abusive relationship. And what they need to do is they need to rebalance the power dynamic. And talking about things is not going to rebalance the power dynamic. Saying they're going to come together is not going to rebalance the power dynamic. The only thing that's going to rebalance it is actual action. They have opportunities for it, right? And the opportunity comes from Ukraine. If they can step up and provide Ukraine with sufficient arms and money so that Ukraine can continue defending itself without needing the United States, they will have proven that they can actually do something. And there's nothing more than Donald Trump respects, and a lot of people respect, than people actually showing that they can do things. Because again, the idea is, Europe it talks about, you were the one that told me, Europe loves to talk about talking rather than actually doing things. So if Europe can do that, then I think they will have reestablished themselves, at least in some small capacity, where they can go and try to negotiate with the U.S. on an equal footing. The entirety of this year, I work for Aspen Institute here, and we're doing our conference next month, and it's called U.S. and Europe, One Future ? Right? This is the topic that every conference has been talking about in Europe. Any security conference is, what is the role here? What's the relationship here? Is it going to be something where it's more transactional? Should we be looking around elsewhere, right? Like to China, to try to make nice with Russia? I say Europe, or should we really try to re-strengthen a relationship, right? Again, I kind of go back to this example of, you're in a tough relationship. Like, do you stick it out and try to work with your partner? Do you start looking around for better partners? Like, this is what Europe has to decide. But its biggest problem is what you mentioned, is that if it cannot come together and decide this collectively, then they're going to get picked apart one by one. And so it is the question on everyone's mind is this existential enough that Europe is finally going to move together? Right now, the answer seems no, because there's too many elections that are going more nationalist, right? We just had election here last month or the month before in the Czech Republic, and the new Prime Minister Babiš was sworn in just a couple days ago. He is not Viktor Orban or even Slovakia's president, Fico. But he's certainly not a globalist. He's certainly not a staunch pro-European type. And so when you have these elections one by one, like you said, you mentioned France is kind of upcoming. That's kind of the big domino, depending on how it goes.
Yes.
If you have all these governments that are their own versions of MAGA that are really focused on themselves, it will be so difficult for Europe to do it. So a lot of the security elites are just talking about Europe coming together and really strengthening its ties. I think the reality is it's not going to happen next year. And even with the crisis of Ukraine, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for them to do. And I think they're going to find themselves a lot more fragmented because there's blocks of countries like the Baltics, like the Nordics, like even the V4 a little bit that see Russia as a threat. There's other countries in the West and the South that see the threat more coming from the South vis-a-vis immigration and terrorist activity coming from North Africa. There is Britain that's in NATO and Turkey that's in NATO that are not in Europe. And what do we do with those two large military/economies? I think it's going to be very problematic. And so far, there hasn't been any great sign besides coming from kind of the liberal global elites that Europe is ready for this challenge. So I think they will help Ukraine. I think that will be one of the unifying things that they've been able to do. They've already started it. But beyond that, I don't know how much they can really come together to counter or at least rebalance the power dynamic with the US.
So continuing the metaphor, the idea is Europe, forget about monogamy that was limiting, go for polygamy.
Start to look around, see who else might be interested out there. You know, like you said with Spain and even going
Free
to China,
love.
right?
Free love. Okay, you just said China, so let's go with China. Let's try. We still have two major powers to be talking about. This is gonna be a long episode, probably into pieces. So let's go with China. We wrote about China in an article called Belt, Road, and Burden. China's rise as a global power rests on a comprehensive toolkit that spans military strength, economic influence, and diplomacy. The PLA, the People Liberations Army, is undergoing a rapid modernization, restructuring for high-tech, intelligence-sized warfare, while expanding naval power and asserting itself more forcefully in the region, particularly around the island of Taiwan. Economically, China's influence has been built through trade and reinforced by the Belt and Road Initiative, which extends Beijing's reach by creating infrastructure linked dependencies along the developing world. Diplomatically, China maintains the largest global diplomatic network that favors flexible partnerships over formal alliances, and it actively shapes a multipolar order through institutions such as BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This is what we know about China. And this is what I think all of our listeners are going to know a little bit about China. One thing that we would like to highlight, though, it's that China, these tools lie deeper in a structural foundation shaped by its geography, its resources, and its industrial capacity. China's fertile eastern plains anchor its population and economy, while the desert and the mountains in the west provide strategic depth, but complicate its development. That's why China, and one day we will have an episode, that's why China has been developed on its own, basically, because they didn't really have invaders except for the northern desert. In the west, you basically cannot enter China unless you want to be climbing all the Himalayas. However, the heavy dependency that China in the end ended up developing in energy and food because of its growth, this dependency transits through vulnerable maritime choke points, and this has driven Beijing's shift toward trying to become a maritime power. This is what we wrote. It's a summary. You can always check article on China to get more information. But I would say that this year for China is sit back and watch. No, how would you say it?
I think that's right. I mean, nothing really has happened on Taiwan, which is always the major flashpoint. There's, of course, been the tariff wars between the US and China. But as we'll talk about later, unless you really follow it closely, you have no idea which tariffs are actually happening, which ones have been announced, which ones have been retracted, which ones have said they're going to happen but aren't actually happening, how much soybeans China is going to buy from the US that they say they're going to buy, how much they actually buy. What I'm most interested in China is, I don't know if you heard about this, but I think it was Trump that proposed essentially a C5, which is basically the five families, right? The biggest countries in the world and the biggest economies. It would be the US, it would be China, it would be India, I think Japan and Russia, maybe something like that. Like maybe they'd add Germany or something just to get one European country in there in terms of the top five.
No, I'm almost certain there is no European.
No, I don't think there is right now for sure. And it's an interesting way of basically saying, well, the G7 only represents democracies, and you've got countries like Italy and Canada in there that like are at most kind of regional players rather than global players. Why not create a dialogue of all of the kind of the biggest movers in the world? The problem is it feels like it's a five families sort of thing. It feels like it's a mafia sort of thing. There's not an accident that the U.S. is the only or one of the only democracies that's represented there. Trump prefers to deal with people in this sort of way that he can just deal with leaders one-on-one instead of having to deal with the EU, having to deal with democratically elected leaders. And that would be a boon for China because, it would give them a seat at the table. I don't think it's a horrible idea, to be honest, because you have to talk to your rivals. It's the same way the US and the USSR had to talk at some point to solve some problems in the Cold War. But it would really shut out Europe from global talks, and it would really kind of recenter the world on kind of these spheres of influence. You had mentioned before we started recording about potentially China through BRICS, talking about a new type of global currency. What's that all about?
So BRICS is actually bringing now together a total of 11 members. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa are the original. Then you have now Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, and in 2025 Indonesia joined the list. Now, this year, what I think is the most important development, first of all, is that BRICS, obviously because Iran is one of its members, BRICS condemned the US and Israeli intervention, bombing of Iran. And also it's condemned the Israelis' actions in Gaza. Therefore, it is already positioning itself. It's more, as we say in the episode, it's not a grouping in a formal sense of it, but it is definitely becoming. It was definitely created to counterbalance the U.S.-led groupings in the world, and it's finding its arguments with whatever the US does in the moment. So in this case, it's and now what have they unveiled this year is a plan to challenge the dollar as the world currency, creating a new currency that is called the unit. As one of the articles that I read about it says, it's not the best naming. They need a bit more marketing. Like Americans, you guys do this much better. The unit. Meh, you couldn't have another. I don't know. Anyway, this unit is supposed to be supported partially by gold and partially by the members' currencies. Therefore, it would allow for these countries to detach from the dollar standard, which is what has given the United States, or one of the reasons for the United States' dominance in global trade since World War II. So this also unveils, they also started exchanging currencies so that their bilateral trade between the member states could be done in their currencies instead of having to use dollars. And for example, China has signed an agreement with Brazil. Well, this year they signed several significant agreements focusing on de-dollarization, trade facilitation, infrastructure, and technology development, so that they can foster the exchange between these two economies as well. For example, China is in need of agricultural products, and Brazil is a great producer of them. So they established a blockchain deal for faster agricultural exports, both in beef and soybean, which are of critical needs for China. So what we are seeing is that China is playing in this multipolar world, and it's trying to, at least it seems like it's trying to have a transactional relation with states, but that it's with individual states and not really calling them out, for example, like the way the transactional of the United States is right now working. And China in 2025, I think, has found the perfect time to just chill and wait until countries call the door and be like, hey, so the United States imposed me a tariff in this. How about I enter your market? So I would say that this has been a great year for China, but not necessarily because of China's policies, but on detriment of the United States. As well, China has kept a balanced position in any conflict, as it does basically historically, unless it's a conflict in their border. But for example, it's kept on working with Ukraine, and it's kept on providing aid and doing trade. At the same time, that is the second largest importer of Russian oil. So China is the winner of this game of multipolarism that we are in right now. That's why, looking to the future, and we've had this argument several times, and I think this is an argument that we'll keep on having next year, because it's the topic of Taiwan and whether if China will actually invade Taiwan or not. Taiwan, we know that resources wise is really important for the production of semiconductors. right now the United States is trying to increase its production of semiconductors. Europe is trying to to increase its production. Japan has its own local production, but I think it's a number. It's a really crazy number. It's somewhere over 70% of all the semiconductors in the world are produced in Taiwan. So if China were to invade Taiwan and get this production capacity, it would have a virtual monopoly over the world production of semiconductors. Now, I have my doubts, and I've always had my doubts about the viability of this project, because from the beginning, these semiconductors projects in Taiwan were sponsored by the United States. So the United States were importing from Taiwan. And now Trump has moved forward into pushing the Taiwanese companies like Nvidia to transfer their production to the United States and transfer the critical assets to the United States. In a way, Taiwan's upper hand to keep the US support in case of a Chinese invasion was always this. And the fact that it's called, is Taiwan the carrier, the fleet carrier of the aircraft carrier of the Pacific of the United States or something like this. I remember reading it in the past, like Israel is the aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean. But if the leverage that Taiwan has to ask the United States for help disappears, then China would probably be more. The United States will not be willing to defend Taiwan, then China will have more options. Now, the impact that an invasion of Taiwan would have in global trade for China, in my opinion, would be too high to dismiss in importance. We've been proven in the past years that countries don't necessarily act rationally and great powers less. But I would say that the way the Chinese government is preparing its future is not in the short term, as, for example, we are doing in liberal economies, in liberal democracies, where we have our governments for 4, 8 years, 10, depending on the constitution, 14 even. But these are short terms, whereas the Chinese are looking at the future in a 100-year period, 50-year period. These agreements that they did with Brazil, for example, they are intended to work for both countries for 50 years now. And this is a perspective that we are lacking. Therefore, if you want to give me your opinion there, I would be really happy to listen to it. But now I would say that this year was a year for China to sit back and just see the escalatory tariffs of the United States. I mean, at one point, the United States put 240% of tariffs in Chinese products, to what the Chinese prime minister came out and said, look, this is nonsensical. We're going to keep them at 80%, and at 80% already trade between the two states is non-existent if this is actually put in place. So they are not falling, at least publicly, for this tit for tat of the United States. Therefore, they're gaining some respect as a more reliable partner than the United States in this moment, in this particular context. However, China has also its issues. It's got a growing debt, given the Belt and Road Initiative projects that are not really fulfilling the goals that they had in the beginning, and many projects are actually ended up being a waste of money. Not a waste of money, but they're definitely becoming much more expensive than they should be. It is said that China has this power grip with the countries in the Belt and Road Initiative of the debt trap, because then China can take part of the land and so on, as it happened, for example, in Sri Lanka. But also the land that they're getting is not really productive because they didn't manage to make the infrastructure project. So it's just going to incur more expenses, which I wonder if China will actually continue if there is a major shift in the international trade that would impact them, since they are the main exporter of the world. How do you see this, Matt? I went into a really long talk here.
I mean, it is the story. We talk about these individual stories that have happened in 2025, but if you take a global overarching narrative, besides in terms of Europe, of whether Europe can really come together, the other massive overarching story is U.S.-China relations. And like you said, this is a great year for China. And they didn't really have to do anything to earn it, which is the frustrating part, is their main rival, the U.S., has shot themselves in the foot. The year started with Trump just pissing off every single ally of the US, whether it's Japan and Korea, whether it's Europe, whether it's Canada, whether it's Mexico, whoever. And the strength of the US in terms of global trade has always been all of these partnerships and alliances, right? That we have them all over the world. And China basically has none. They have their Shanghai Cooperation, but that's relatively small and not nearly as robust as all of these other partnerships. So they got to sit back and watch Trump just fire shots to all of these traditional allies. And these traditional allies don't necessarily want to go outside of the US. They're relatively happy with the global order, even if they are kind of grumble every once in a while that the US has too much power. It's generally worked for so many countries to be part of this liberal trade global order, at least in terms of kind of the wealthier countries or countries that are kind of middle or regional powers. So it's not like China was a particularly attractive option. As you say, it's still a communist government. You still have to give up your technology to Chinese companies, which basically the government has a, if not back door, a front door to all of these techs. So this is not anything where China is necessarily a more attractive option, but China got to sit and watch the US completely give away its advantage. And they had to do basically nothing to do that. All they had to do, as you say, is sit back, wait, and not make too many moves. It's probably one of the reasons that Taiwan has been pretty quiet this year is they know if they did something on Taiwan, like you said, it's not rational in terms of how much they want it. It's kind of an irrational national interest to some extent. But rationally, they thought, okay, we have a good hand right now. If we try to invade Taiwan right now, we're absolutely overplaying our hand. It's kind of the similar thing to what Russia did. They had a decent hand in terms of having Europe by the throat a little bit in terms of gas and oil supply. And what did they do? They overplayed that hand by invading Ukraine. They ended up expanding NATO. They ended up kind of getting Europe to come together, which had never really happened before. And like you said, they ended up kind of really transitioning away from Russian gas instead of being more dependent on it, right? So they completely overplayed their hand. China hasn't done that with Taiwan. They've said, wow, we have advantages for just doing nothing. This is just like passive income at this point. And the more the US just kind of shoots itself in the foot, the more countries, albeit even reluctantly, will start coming to talk to China because they're just kind of frustrated with how the US is doing things. Even the uncertainty of Trump's tariffs. One day it's one thing, one day it's not. They're still going through the courts in terms of whether it's going to be even allowable in some of these instances, where China is more of a sure thing. The other thing, I heard this one time at a conference and I really liked it. They were talking about how Russians play chess. They want to beat you and they want to destroy you and they want to do it quickly in as few moves as possible. The Chinese play Go. Go is a much more long-winded strategic game where the goal is not to beat someone but trap your opponent so they can't make any moves anymore. And it's one of the most beautiful analogies I've ever seen because, as you say, China doesn't think in year-long terms. They have 5-year plans, but they are thinking in much longer time horizons than a lot of liberal democracies based on their election cycles. And so they're playing Go right now. They're making slow moves that aren't going to do too much alarming anywhere, and slowly but surely start moving red lines, slowly but surely start putting things into place such that at some point, other countries won't really have a choice and they don't really have any outs, right? This is kind of what they're trying to do with solar panels. This is what they're trying to do with rare earth minerals. And at the same time, they're trying to secure, their own backyard. They're trying to secure the South China Sea. They're trying to make sure that they have outlets to that kind of global trade. They're trying to go around Singapore and the Strait of Malacca. They're trying to go potentially through Thailand and potentially build basically a canal through there. So they're not beholden to kind of a more Western-leaning power. So they're doing all of these small things, and they're absolutely doing it in this wait-and-see moment. I mean, the U.S. and the world is distracted, somewhat rightly so, by Ukraine and Russia, by Israel and Gaza, and it really has allowed, 2025 has allowed China to operate kind of without consequence because its main foe is just making all the wrong moves, and everyone else is distracted. So there's no bandwidth for China unless they do something drastic like Taiwan, and they've been smart enough not to do it. Now, as you say, they have plenty of their own internal problems, and will all these moves pan out, or will they go into too much debt because they've just overreached? That remains to be seen. But you have to say their hand is much stronger at the end of 2025 than it was even at the beginning of 2025.
I would absolutely agree with that. Yes. Okay. Shall we go to the end of our series of great powers? Please, let's go with Russia.
Let's talk about Russia. This is one of the first articles I actually wrote for the newsletter. It's called Of Missiles and Myths. And so we analyze the pillars of Russian power. We discuss how, despite a massive nuclear arsenal and obviously high military spending since the Soviet era, the war in Ukraine has exposed critical vulnerabilities in conventional capabilities and homeland defense. We're going to be talking about Ukraine a lot here in the section. We analyze natural resources, which we've talked about in terms of oil and gas, industrial capacity, population, the binding force of geography, which basically is Russia is a landlocked power, despite the fact that they have some Black Sea access, some Arctic North Sea access. Truly, because of the lack of warm water ports, they are basically a landlocked power. And that has dictated Moscow's grand strategy for time immemorial, from Putin to Stalin to the Tsars. So they're an energy superpower. They've got the world's largest natural gas reserves. They've got industrial capacity, but it's kind of Soviet-era stuff and a lot of borrowing from Chinese technology at this point. And the war effort has gone on way longer than Vladimir Putin ever thought. Probably all the oligarchs thought as well. So they've overheated the economy. They're pretty much all defense production focused. And sanctions. We haven't really talked about sanctions, but sanctions have been working. They have put a heavy toll on everything. They've had an over-reliance on Chinese technology. They have to sell their oil. I want you to talk about the shadow fleet, which you mentioned earlier. So it's a huge economic reality, and they're talking, and it's really going to be compounding by some demographic imbalances, right? 3/4 of the population is crowded to the west of the Urals. They've got a massive resource-rich Siberia, but it's pretty empty. It's difficult to develop. Climate change could help them, in fact, as one of the few countries that might be helped by climate change. So Russia is always an interesting opaque type character because it's been its way for so long. So many things haven't changed in terms of Russia, what is happening. They still lack defensive natural barriers on the West, which always makes them really skittish about anything going on. Even though Europe's military is really not capable at the moment, they still fear this invasion from the West because it happened with Napoleon and happened with Hitler, and those memories last quite long. They have strategic depth, but at the same time, they see NATO on its borders. They know NATO controls choke points, like you mentioned, the waterways around Norway, Turkey, and the Black Sea. So they're kind of feel like they're surrounded on all sides. The Pacific side of Russia doesn't really gain that much advantage. There's not a lot of ports there. What they have is often frozen over for half the year. So they're in an interesting spot where they have one or two really good cards to play. And those cards are oil and natural gas and nuclear arsenal. And they haven't really been able to, they play those cards well enough in terms of the 2000s and 2010s of basically kind of getting their way in really small areas, right? Everyone knows the history of Russian aggression in terms of Georgia, in terms of 2014 in Ukraine, even before Ukraine, before in 2009 in Ukraine, all of these countries that Russia has still under their influence, but that's about all they've been able to project. And when they thought they would have a quick, 1 week long war, capture Kiev and call it good, they've kind of been embarrassed by an upstart country, albeit with a backing of the West, that they've shown that besides oil and nuclear arms, which obviously you have to take seriously, they're not really a serious power. And all they can do is throw young men and young women at the problem in the hundreds of thousands in terms of casualties that have died in the Ukrainian war, and hope that at some point they grind Ukraine down and that they, quote unquote, win. But Russia is another year of they needed Ukraine to be over yesterday, and it's looking nowhere close to being over. What are your thoughts about Russia and some of the things that happened vis-a-vis Ukraine this year?
I mean, I would 100% agree with you that the war is definitely not going the way they thought that it was going to go. We are in the 4th year of the. I like one tweet. It's called Darth Putin. It's a Twitter account. It says, "Year 3.5 of my 2-week invasion." Um, and basically, yes, there's been Russian advances in the last couple months. This is something that is undeniable in the regions in in the east of Ukraine. But still, the estimates of, for example, the Institute of Study of War, which I rely a lot to get information from the war, says that it would take them years to take over their regions, not even to get closer to Kiev. Um, so the advances are, as you say, at the cost at really heavy costs. One thing that we can say is that the war in Ukraine is definitely changing the the perspective on how to make war. Basically, the heavy use of drone, the development of new tactics, the development of new mix tactics of hybrid warfare with cyber attacks, with drones, with special assaults and stuff. This is definitely going to change the way we see war forever, in my opinion, especially for everybody actually in this case, because drones can be made by anybody at a really, really low cost. So those are the advances of this year. Ukraine is not in a better situation. Ukraine is in a worse situation. And well, we also the I'm gonna say I've been containing myself for the entire podcast. Pardon my friends. We also the shit show that the Trump and Zelensky meeting in the White House was the first one, which was really difficult to see from I think from any human being's perspective, but from the perspective of people that are studying these topics, this is something like once in a lifetime I've seen this. Like not even between countries at war, like between countries that there's been really problematic issues. I've never seen such a way of behaving with another world leader. That basically portrayed that Ukraine with this new American administration is in a worse bargaining situation because what they can offer the United States is their natural resources, which is also what I think in the end Russia is going to accept as compensation for the war, because I don't know if you would agree. I'd say the idea was regime change, not invading the entire country. This did not work out, dragged them into a 4-year war so far, and there is no advancement enough. But you need to sell something as a victory. So you would probably sell that you got the resources, which the regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia, they are rich in iron ore, they have fertile land. However, just as it happened to China, I'd say Russia has seen another year of, okay, let's wait and see what gifts am I getting from Santa Claus this year, because I think they've been given an upper hand in the negotiations that they did not have, thanks to the United States. The United States has put Moscow again at the center, or even leading of the negotiations of peace with Ukraine. It's giving the actions of Washington are giving Moscow such a leverage to enter the negotiations. These things we will know them in 50 years, but if it's true, for example, that the United States the envoy leaked information to the Russians of Ukraine's situation so that the Russians could get a better deal in the negotiations, that's something that we will discover in 50 years, but that would be outrageous by any terms on today's world. And clearly they found themselves back on the picture because their economy was shaking, their military was shaking. Yes, they were sustained by China and India in economic terms, selling their oil, but the political strength that Washington has given Moscow was not there at the end of 2024.
Do you think, because Trump wanted to make a deal, all he wants is a peace prize and say he's ended this war, and you're right, in February it looked very grim for Zelensky and Ukrainians, but then he's kind of swung back and forth because he was upset at Putin for a while, and there's this famous adage that Trump just basically believes whoever spoke to him last. And at some point, Zelensky had his ear and spoke to him last, and then he was sort of frustrated with Putin that it wasn't ending the war. He thought, hey, I'm giving you this deal, you should do it. Do you think Putin made a mistake? Because, as you said, he had a lot more leverage in 2025 than he did in 2024. There were terms that the Trump administration was pushing that was definitely not great for Ukraine. and pretty favorable to Russia and would have allowed them to have a gracious sort of off ramp of this war. Do you think he messed up by not taking the time and instead basically got Trump mad at him for kind of not being willing to negotiate?
I don't think it matters whether if he got him angry or mad or not, because I think that if Trump gets mad enough, he will just pull out of Ukraine entirely and forget about the conflict. So I wouldn't see I wouldn't see it as a problem that Trump gets bothered by the conflict. Quite the contrary. If he wants, the way he's presented everything to the public is that he's going to finish all those wars in 2 weeks. No, like I finished state conflicts and Ukraine is going to be next. If Trump cannot finish the conflict in Ukraine, he's gonna leave the conflict in Ukraine. He's not gonna put boots on the ground. He's not gonna give more assistance to the Ukrainian government because it's also a scapegoat for him, like internally speaking. Now, did the Russians miss an upper hand the way you're saying? Probably yes. Probably yes. But the thing is that the Russians have been playing their own game all this time.
They're holding out for something better.
Exactly,
I think, right?
exactly. They're holding out for something better, and I'd say at this point, this war is existential for the regime. If you cannot present an actual victory that you can properly sell to the public, you've radicalized your population so much that they're gonna want blood, or you're gonna have internal struggle with the economic situation. So keeping the war machine, and Russia in 2025 has basically turned already completely into a wartime economy. If you shut this now, you're gonna head into economic crisis because you don't have anything to change it with. Your industry is poor at best. You have raw materials. You will basically become a periphery state that provides raw materials to emerging powers. In this situation, China can boost as much as they want Russia can boost as much as they want their nuclear weapons, which is the only thing that keeps them at the table, in my opinion. If Russia did not have nuclear weapons, Russia would be a peripheral state with a lot of AK-47s, but a peripheral state, because it is proven that in 4 years they have not been able to beat Ukraine. Yes, of course, Ukraine has the support of the European Union and the United States, but it's also been clear that Ukraine did not receive as much as possible from these states. So if you cannot deal with the help of non-militarized industries given to a country that is militarizing as we speak, how are you going to deal with the already more military focused big industries that you have in your West in case you actually want to fight them? I'd say, I mean, it's really bold. The problem with Russia is that I think we can all agree that it's become the knuckleball of the 21st century. Is this entity that you really don't know how they're gonna go, because it depends on a balancing of their internal power struggle with their external image, with a massive influence of some imperialistic mentality in the leadership, which coupled with an insane amount of corruption that is institutionalized, and it is the state in itself at this point, zero acceptance for dissent, but at the same time you are there's your country is so vast, and you're taking so many young men from regions that are peripheral that you may start having trouble there. So you may start to have you may start to shift your internal security focus into your own, so that you don't get any uprisings there. I know Russia is really cold, but Russia is also the home of the Russian Revolution. And I like to see things from history, and history doesn't tend to lie. I disagree with the fact that it repeats itself, that it doesn't lie. If Russia loses this war, and I think this is how the leadership sees it now. If Russia loses the war or doesn't manage to get results, they're gonna face a 1917 situation with World War I, because the country's economy is not gonna sustain itself. So they're not gonna leave the war. So what is the situation going forward? This is the conflict that I have my biggest doubts with, because I think the only solution for the conflict is what we call in our field a black swan. It's an event that we have not predicted or that has not been given enough enough thought or has not been in the spotlight, and that is the event that actually ends the war one way or another.
Putin dies, right?
Putin dies. The United States, China decides that it's not worth it for Russia to keep on attacking. So they just, I think Russia is right now China's rabid dog, but it's on a leash. As long as China keeps the leash, they're gonna move. If China loses the grip, the dog is gonna keep on running and it's gonna fall into a lake. And I think that's the current situation, because that's the only thing that sustains the government right now. Who were the people that helped them retake the Kursk region? North Koreans. In the security provisions that they've given to the countries in the Sahel since they had their revolutions, since their coups in between 2022 and 2024, between 2020 and 2024, where they replaced the French forces there, first with the Wagner Group and then with the new form Africa Corps. They haven't been able to provide the security guarantees to these countries that they were saying that they were going to provide. So they are failing in providing the security to the allies that they're making along the way. And they are not able to sustain their own conventional war. So their only resort is nuclear in order to keep themselves in that position. Would their, in my opinion, greatest validator, which is China, would accept Russia using nukes? I have my doubts, because you're playing a risk, and if you use the nukes, you're basically taking the table up and you're just twisting everything. You're starting a new era where China doesn't have the upper hand. I have my big doubts with Russia.
I think it's been a bad year for Russia, even though, as you say, they've had gains, because now, like you say, their only way out is through. They had off ramps that would have given them rationally some really decent ends that they could sell to their people as a victory and then try to move on and get out of sanctions. And instead, they're basically putting all of their money on a bet that's less and less likely to win. It's still possible, but the paths out have gotten narrower and the stakes have gotten higher and higher for them, which is crazy to say because it's existential for Ukraine, right? Like, they're the ones worried about their country being completely invaded. But it seems like the country that's in greater danger, that's more fragile, is actually Russia, the invader in this case, who theoretically has the upper hand military-wise, because, as you say, they have pushed themselves into a corner and are hoping that there is a little alleyway that they can get out of this, because if not, it's going to be really, really difficult. What's horrible is all the people dying for this stuff, because there is no great end in sight. To me, if Putin didn't accept Trump's very, very generous terms that would happen around April or March or something like that, that really would have been considered a Russian victory, that Russia's now back on the world stage. They had a one-on-one meeting with Trump in Alaska. They felt like they had their prestige back. They had all of these sort of medium term or medium level gains that they absolutely could have used. And instead they're going all in on one option. And whether that works or not is going to be how much the public has appetite for hundreds of thousands of casualties, how much their economy can survive sanctions, how much their new buyers are willing to keep buying Russian oil, which I actually want to get your take on as we go through oil. But I think it's more precarious for Russia, despite the fact that it has had some actual territorial gains.
This is the end of part 1. The second part of the 2025 recap special episode will be released next week. Stay tuned for more. The Geopolitical Pickle is created by Ronan Wordsworth and Juan Francisco Muñoz. Follow us on Instagram @The Geopolitical Pickle or Twitter @The Geopickle for more content, and follow us on every podcast platform.